the recording now.
Thanks. Hi, and welcome to this Science Breakfast webinar about the importance of the other greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide. My name is Christine, and I'm Head of Communications at NILU, Norwegian Institute for Air Research. And today I'm also the moderator for the webinar, which means that I will give this short introduction to begin with, and then I'll do my best to keep track of your incoming questions. With us is also Erik Tollefsen from CICERO as technical support. And I would also like to point out that the webinar will be recorded and made available on the Science webpage and Facebook page later. If you have any questions, you can use the Q&A function here in Zoom to submit them, and we will save up all questions for later, but feel free to submit them whenever. You can also mark your question with the name of the scientist you want to ask something. So what is CIENS? CIENS is a strategic collaboration between the research institutes CICERO, the Meteorological Institute, NIBR at OsloMet, NICU, NINA, NIVA, TØI, University of Oslo, and NILU. And together we constitute Norway's and one of Europe's largest research communities on the environment, climate, and society. These breakfast webinars are one of our common arenas for research dissemination. And we all take turns contributing to the webinars. And today, NILU, together with CICERO, is responsible for the content. Our first presenter today is senior scientist Rona Thompson from NILU, and she will talk about sources and trends in atmospheric methane and nitrous oxide. And then senior researchers Ragnhild Biltet-Skeie from CICERO will give a short presentation on methane and the role of atmospheric chemistry, before research director Glenn Peters, also from CICERO, gives the final presentation on methane's and nitrous oxide's role in the climate system. And finally, we round off the seminar with questions and discussions. And with that, I yield our virtual floor to Rona.
Yes, so thank you for the introduction. As Christine mentioned, I'm talking about trends in atmospheric methane and nitrous oxide over the last 1.5 decades. So, methane and nitrous oxide are the second and third most important long-lived greenhouse gases after CO2 in terms of their radiative forcing. Methane has a relatively short lifetime, about 10 years, so targeting its emissions now would result in reductions in atmospheric concentrations in relatively short timescales. And that's why it's also a political interest in reducing methane emissions, as in the initiative and the Methane Pledge, which Glenn will talk about later. Nitrous oxide, on the other hand, has a very long lifetime, about 116 years. Thus, the N2O we emit now will mean a long-term commitment in terms of warming. So this talk is going to be about how concentrations and emissions of methane and N2O have been evolving globally over the last approximately 1.5 decades. Here I show the global methane budget. This is a diagram prepared by the Global Carbon Project. And here you can see the different sources and the main sinks of methane. In orange, you see the anthropogenic sources. These are specifically from fossil fuel use and production, agriculture and waste, sources such as enteric fermentation and landfills, for instance. And then as a sort of dashed orange and green arrow is biomass burning and biofuel burning, so both anthropogenic and natural sources there. From the natural sources, in green, we have wetlands and wet soils generally, and other natural emissions from ocean, inland waters, as well as geological seeps and termites, for instance. And the main sink of methane is in the atmosphere, and 90% of that is due to the hydroxyl radical. And since there is an imbalance in the total net emissions and the total sink, so the emissions slightly outweigh the sink, we have an increase in the atmospheric concentration of methane. This can be seen from observations, and here I show plots from NOAA, who operate a global flask sampling network. And this has already been operating since the early 80s. And you see in the 80s and through into the 90s, methane was increasing in the atmosphere. And then in the late 90s and early 2000s, it leveled off. So the system had reached a sort of approximately a steady state. But from 2007, methane has been increasing again. And you can also see this from the growth rates shown on the right. And this is just the annual change in methane concentration. And you see a positive growth rate in the 80s and into the 90s. And then hovering around zero through the early 2000s. And then from 2007, again, a positive growth rate. And what's really notable is that the last 2 years, so 2020 and 2021, were record increases in methane in the atmosphere. So about 15 parts per billion per year. So whatever explanation that we find for the increase in methane needs to explain a few other observations. So there are various scenarios that we can think of to explain the methane change. It could be increases in the emissions, it could be a decrease in the atmospheric sink, or it could be a combination of both. To whatever explanation, it needs to be able to explain also the trend in delta 13, which has been decreasing. If you're not familiar with what this is, delta 13 is a ratio between carbon 13 to carbon 12 in a sample of methane, normalized by the ratio in a reference, and that is by convention reported in the units of per mil. And what does this actually help? Different sources have different values of delta 13. So microbial sources have the most depleted methane in terms of carbon 13, and landfills, also a microbial source, slightly less depleted than, for example, wetlands. And then you have fossil fuel sources, which are less depleted, and the least depleted are those from biomass burning. Another trend that needs to be explained is the trend in ethane. And ethane has been increasing as well from particularly 2010 up to around 2015, and after that leveled off. And ethane is an interesting tracer for methane because it's co-emitted with fossil fuel sources of methane. It's also emitted from biomass burning and from the ocean, but they're relatively small. And it has no negligible microbial sources. So that makes an interesting tracer to look at as well. So if we look at the first scenario, so an increase in the emissions, here are the emission estimates from an inventory called EDGAR. And they've just shown here the main sources, and you can see that these have increased from 2004. If we look at where they have been increasing, you see here by latitudinal band, the change in coal from the period, so 2004 to 2006 versus the period 2018 to 2020. And coal has increased a little bit everywhere except for in the far south. Oil and gas has increased a lot in the northern mid to high latitudes, but very little elsewhere. And then interestingly, waste and livestock emissions have thought to have increased mostly in the tropical and subtropical north, and increased only a little bit elsewhere. The other scenario is OH. It's a hydroxyl radical, which is responsible for 90% of the atmospheric sink. And OH is very short-lived in the atmosphere, so it cannot really be measured directly. So we have to infer the concentrations by looking at either other species that react with OH, but for which we think we know the emissions, for example, methylchloroform, or using atmospheric chemistry transport models, or ACTMs. And there's a bit of let's say, diversion in what these estimates are predicting. So those from atmospheric chemistry transport models show an increasing OH trend up to, in this figure, it's only up to 2015. Whereas those inferred from methylchloroform changes result in a decrease in OH from 2005. So there is some uncertainty in the OH concentration, and I'll talk a little bit about the impact of that. Also, just to note that OH, so if the OH is decreasing without any change in emissions, that would lead to an increase in methane in the atmosphere. For delta 13, it's also affected by OH. So OH reacts preferentially with the lighter carbon 12. And so OH reaction enriches the atmosphere in carbon 13 methane. So a reduction in the OH sink would lead to less enrichment, so possibly a decrease in the delta 13. I should also mention that Ranhild will talk a lot about OH in the next talk, so I won't go into more details than that. So we can look at these different scenarios by using atmospheric transport models and see how these different emissions and sink estimates are able to reproduce the observed concentrations. And that's what I'm showing here is just using a relatively simple 2D model of the atmosphere. Why a 2D model? So this model is very fast to run, so you can look at different scenarios very quickly. Whereas if you use a full 3D model, these are very computationally intensive, very, very useful. But if you just want to quickly explore different scenarios, it would take a long time. So here, using the Edgar emissions with estimates for natural sources as well, we see that the model, is shown in blue here, the prior model, departs from the observed concentration in methane. Also, for the delta 13 signal, also departs from the observation quite significantly. And ethane, in the model, ethane is basically flat, has no trend over the time, whereas we see in the observation there is some variability and a small positive trend too. So with the 2D model, we can also do optimization using a Bayesian inversion. And this methane observations, and as well as delta 13, can be assimilated to adjust the sources and the sinks to best match the observed trends. And so with the optimized model, as shown in red here, or posterior, we see that it perfectly matches the changes in methane and delta 13. And so ethane was not assimilated, but the optimized emissions coupled with the Ford transport model better reproduce the observed changes in ethane as well. So if we want to look at how does the model adjust these emissions? So for the fossil fuel emissions, the model has increased these in the Northern Hemisphere and finds a peak around 2005, 2006, and then a little decrease to 2010, and then it sort of levels off. From microbial sources, these are due to natural wetlands as well as agricultural and agricultural sources. The model finds a lower microbial emissions both in the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere, but with a steeper trend, so in the Northern Hemisphere, greater increase. For waste, not much change compared to the prior, and also for biomass burning, not much change compared to the prior. For OH, the OH estimate was taken from an atmospheric chemistry transport model that has remained relatively close to the prior estimate, but it finds a decrease in 2020, which I'll talk a little bit about as well. Comparing so these simple 2D model results with 3D models. So compare here with the set of the Global Carbon Project models, which were run only up until 2017. And so here you see on the right, the results of a number of inversion models used in the Global Carbon Project. And this is the change from 2017 versus the mean of 2000 to 2006 for different source types. So in brown is the fossil fuel, and blue is agriculture and waste, and the reddish color is biomass burning, for instance. The paler color is always from the inversion estimate, and the darker color is from the so-called bottom-up or inventory estimates. On the left is the result from the simple 2D model, and you see that the change in fossil fuel agrees quite well with the 3D models. In this estimate, the microbial increase is larger than found from 3D models. That also might just be because this model goes all the way up to 2020. And yeah, a little small increase in waste and a small decrease in biomass burning emissions. The Global Carbon Project estimates find that these changes have mostly occurred in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. And you can read about those Global Carbon Project results in a paper by Jackson et al. In Environmental Research Letters. So now about the 2020 anomaly. I've written anomaly in quotations because now with the 2021 results, it's not really sure whether we can talk about an anomaly or not, or whether this might be a new trend. So I was involved in a study that was looking at this anomaly and using an atmospheric inverse modeling and terrestrial ecosystem models as well. So the inversions all found an increase in methane net emissions in 2020 relative to 2019. And this also was the result of terrestrial ecosystem models, which model wetland emissions. They all found an increase as well, but the amount of the increase varied depending on the meteorological input data that was used, and also where this increase was occurring. So whether it was mostly in the high northern latitudes or the subtropics, it's quite uncertain. To support this, meteorological data does show in the high northern latitudes, that's the top left plot, that there was an increase in the anomaly in the temperature as well as in the precipitation. So both these factors would go to drive higher methane emissions from wetlands. In the high northern latitudes in 2020, there was an extreme heat wave over Siberia. It's unclear whether this contributed to higher methane or not. It's something it would be interesting to examine. So subtropical to tropical north, there was not really much of an anomaly, small positive anomaly perhaps in temperature. And in the south, again, this small anomaly in temperature. And in the far south, means the negative anomaly in precipitation. The other possible cause of the so-called anomaly in 2020 is a change in OH. And in this study, they used an atmospheric chemistry transport model to model OH, using as accurate as possible estimates of the species which are important in determining OH concentrations, such as NOx and carbon monoxide. NOx emissions, so NOx helps to produce OH, so higher NOx emissions would mean higher OH. And actually in 2020, it's thought that the NOx emissions are actually strongly reduced due to COVID restrictions on economic activity. And you see in this model that the NOx emissions were reduced in over North America, Europe, India, and China, and especially in the spring to early summer. And in the OH, the reductions were quite widespread over the Northern Hemisphere. And again, the maximum reduction occurring in spring to early summer. In total, it's thought that this model estimates about a 1.6 to 2% reduction in OH. So overall, what is thought, or the best explanation that we have so far, is that the growth rate anomaly in methane is due about 59% to OH reduction and about 41% to an increase in wetland emissions. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about nitrous oxide. Here again, I've used a figure from the Global Carbon Project. It shows the different sources of nitrous oxide in the sink. The anthropogenic sources, again, shown in orange. And these are by and large due to agriculture and also due to wastewater. There is a small source from biomass burning and from fossil fuel and chemicals industries. And it's also a so-called indirect emission, which is just due to increased anthropogenic input of nitrogen into the environment, inducing a larger nitrous oxide emission compared to that naturally. Natural sources are from land, so soils under natural vegetation, and the ocean, somewhat from inland waters as well. And there's an atmospheric sink. Now, this sink is in the stratosphere, and it's due to the actinic flux, so photochemistry, and due to the oxygen radicals. And again, there's the sources outweigh the sink, and so we have an increase in N2O in the atmosphere. And we can see this again using figures from NOAA. And this time series starts in the early 2000s, and you see that it's been increasing, I mean, really steadily from then. And if you look at the growth rate, what is really notable is not only is the growth rate positive, but it's increasing. So the rate of increase in N2O in the atmosphere is increasing. So it's, I could say it's accelerating. And in 2020, again, there was a record increase in N2O. And 2021 was the third largest increase recorded. So what we know about N2O is anthropogenic emissions, especially that from agriculture, so use of nitrogen fertilizer especially, is responsible for the increase throughout the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. That's quite well understood. And in this, here I show you the results of so-called NMIP models, which are used in the global carbon nitrous oxide budget. And they show the increase from 1980 to 2017. So the largest contribution to the increase in anthropogenic emissions is from agriculture. It's 87%, and yeah, small increases in the other sources. Looking at the inversion results, so this is here showing the Copernicus Atmospheric Monitoring Service inversion, and this is from 1996 to 2019. Red is the inversion result and blue is the prior estimates. So the inversion finds globally larger N2O emissions, but also a larger trend in the emissions and much more interannual variability. And regionally, in South America, it also shows larger emissions than the prior, a slightly larger trend. And also in what's interesting in Asia, that the trend, East Asia, is the trend is quite a lot larger in the inversion than it is in the prior estimate. And a little bit about the so-called anomaly in N2O, if we can call it that or not. So here, just initial work looking at this N2O growth rate anomaly. And the plot on the left shows the growth rate as a function of the latitude and time. And what is interesting here is that you see that the growth rate anomaly in red starts in the northern hemisphere, and then there's a lag by the time it gets to the southern hemisphere. You can also see this in the figure on the right, where the peak and the growth rate occurs earlier in the high northern latitudes, and then there's a lag into the southern hemisphere. So we suspect that the source of this anomaly is occurring really in the northern hemisphere. And what we know about N2O, it's only lost in the stratosphere and it has a long lifetime. So it's unlikely that, you know, they would have really large, rapid change anomalies in the sink. So we think that's very unlikely. Stratospheric tropospheric exchange. This is affected by, for example, the quasi-biennial oscillation. That there's this biennial oscillation in the stratospheric tropospheric exchange, which affects N2O in the troposphere. There is some evidence of a 2020 anomaly, but this influence of this is mostly seen on N2O in the southern hemisphere, whereas we think the origin of the anomaly is in the northern hemisphere. Soils account for more than 60% of the global nitrous oxide source. So perhaps we should look at that for an explanation. And also, based on the analysis for methane, we see that there were in the northern hemisphere, there was a positive anomaly in temperature and precipitation in 2020. And those factors also affect nitrous oxide emissions. And just results from last night, which I include here, which I have to analyze a bit more carefully, but this plot on the top shows the anomaly, so the prior in the atmospheric model, prior emissions, so the 2020 minus the mean of the period 2004 to 2020. You see that it doesn't really pick up much difference there in 2020. And then looking at the inversion results, so the posterior, and you see here, so again, so the 2020 emissions minus the mean of 2004 to 2020. And here you see that the inversion is finding so higher emissions in 2020 in across Northern Eurasia and in North America. So this has to be looked at in more detail. So as I said, these results came in last night. So I haven't had much time to look at those in detail. So to summarize, atmospheric methane has increased between 2006 and 2021 with record annual increases in 2020, 2021. And this trend has been concurrent with a decrease in delta 13 and an increase in ethane. So likely explanations are increase in fossil fuel emissions, especially earlier in that time series. And then later in that time series, an increase in microbial emissions, most likely due to agriculture and waste. OH reduction is unlikely, especially given the changes in NOx and CO emissions. And the so-called anomaly in 2020 is likely to be in part due to reduction in OH and in part an increase in wetland emissions. For nitrous oxide, again, N2O has been increasing in the atmosphere and at an accelerating rate, and also record annual increase in 2020 and the third largest increase in 2021. Increasing agricultural emissions is very likely the cause of the trend, and the so-called anomaly in 2020 is possibly due to changes in soil emissions in the Northern Hemisphere, but needs to be examined in more detail. And just to conclude, so work on the methane budget is ongoing, and just briefly mention that there is an NFR funded project which is led by NILU called REGAME, which will look in detail at the global methane budget as well as the Northern European methane sources. And yeah, thank you for your attention. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rona. We've had a couple of questions already. We're saving them for later, but I just want to remind everyone that to use the Q&A function to send in questions, and you can also mark them with if they're for Rona or if they are for Ragnhild or Glenn. Yeah, thanks again, Rona and Ragnhild. Please take the floor.
Yes. Yes, you see my presentation now. Thank you, Christina. So I will talk about the methane and the role of atmospheric chemistry related to the methane budget and the methane trend. So Rona showed this figure here from the global methane budget. So the sources of methane at the left side of the figure, but what I will focus on is the sink of methane, the dominant sink, that is chemical reactions in the atmosphere. This figure here is from the latest IPCC report from the Working Group 1 last year. These figures show the sources and sinks for each decade since 1980. And the line in the middle here is the atmospheric concentration. And it is the imbalance shown here in red that determine the changes in the atmospheric methane. So when the imbalance is larger, the atmospheric concentration increase. And when the imbalance is small, the atmospheric concentration is more flat. And we should keep in mind that it's the methane budgets consist of large sources and sinks. that are all associated with large uncertainties, and only small changes in these big terms can affect the methane trend. And the dominant loss of methane is through the oxidation in the atmosphere via the hydroxyl radical. This is a hydroxyl radical. You can also think of hydroxyl radical as a vacuum cleaner in the atmosphere, or the superhero of the atmosphere. So OH removes pollutants from the atmosphere, like methane, carbon monoxide, SO2, other hydrocarbons, etc. So if you get more OH in the atmosphere, the lifetime of these gases will be shorter and the sink will be larger. And if you get less OH in the atmosphere, the lifetime of methane will be longer and the sink term will be smaller, and this will affect the concentration of methane in the atmosphere. So OH forms in the troposphere, then you need sunlight, ozone, and water vapor. And this mechanism was identified 50 years ago. And the lifetime of OH in the atmosphere is less than a second. So, and it has very low concentration. So it's very difficult to measure and impossible to get a global coverage of the concentration and look at trends. So we have to rely on global chemistry models that I will talk about, but Rona also mentioned that you can infer OH concentration in the atmosphere from observation of some halocarbons. These or one particular gas that has been used is controlled by the Montreal Protocol. So the concentration of this gas is now very low in the atmosphere, and that makes it challenging to use this method, at least into the future. Yes, so this figure is from this same, these figures show the trends in OH from global chemistry models. So from the 1850 and up to 2014. And the models show quite similar temporal development of OH, with a sharp increase in OH from the 1980s and up to 2014. An increase of 9%. And why the models show very similar temporal development is that they are all driven by the same emissions. And OH in the models, as Rona also mentioned, is dependent on the NOx emissions and the CO emissions. If you increase NOx emission, NOx is important in ozone chemistry, so then you will increase OH in the model and the methane lifetime will decrease. If you increase CO, CO will also react with OH in the atmosphere, so then OH will decrease and then the methane lifetime will increase. But it's important to keep in mind that emissions uncertainties for this component are not assessed. But in this paper, providing these emissions, they stated that it was larger than 15%, but less than a factor of 2. And this was on global scale, and it's even larger uncertainties on regional scales. Yeah, and as you see in this figure here, both NOx emissions and CO emissions has a large share from the transportation sector. And as you know, especially this sector was affected by the COVID restrictions. And the NOx emission is that the component that was reduced the most during the lockdowns. But also CO was reduced. So what the effect of these emissions on the OH in the atmosphere is quite interesting. And using the Oslo chemistry transport model, I get a large reduction in OH, 2%, quite similar to what Rona showed in the previous presentation. And this is only due to the changes in the emissions. And this will reduce the methane sink and increase the imbalance. And then I am at my summary slide, but I included one figure. So if you take into account the changes in OH from the chemical transport models, focus on the green lines here. So the change in these in the 90s and 2000s may have contributed to the stabilization of methane in the early 2000s. And it has possibly contributed to the growth in methane in 2020. So the atmospheric chemistry models that are driven by the same emission inventories give similar relative trends in OH. But there are large uncertainties that are not quantified in the global emissions of NOx and CO that are even larger on a regional scale. And we should keep in mind that in the methane budget, there are large sources and sinks that are all associated with large uncertainties, and only small changes in these can modify the trend. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Ragnhild. You did very good with the time, by the way. Glenn, you ready?
Yes, I'm set, I think. Hello, everyone. Good to join you. Some interesting presentations. I've been wondering myself what's happened in 2020 and explains those changes that we've seen in the observations. So fascinating to listen to for me as well. In this presentation, I hope to broaden out and give a sort of big picture perspective on what role methane and nitrous oxide play in the climate more broadly, both in terms of the temperature changes and also in terms of mitigation and, let's say, achieving 1.5 degree goals. So let me see. First of all, some climate science 101, as I call it, a bit of background on what's causing the temperature change that we see today. So this figure, most of which is whited out, so you'll see the details in a minute. At the moment, it just shows the current observed warming in the last decade, 2010, 2019, relative to pre-industrial, so 1850, 1900. This is directly from the IPCC, the last assessment report last year from Working Group 1. And we sort of see around about 1.1 degree of warming in the last decade relative to pre-industrial. So where is that warming coming from? So the thing that we hear the most about is carbon dioxide, and that's causing, well, estimated to be about 0.8 degrees of the current warming based on all the historical emissions up to today. And you see there's a big gap here. So what's causing the rest? And there's lots of things. So, there's methane, which is very important, which is why we talk about it so much. So the current warming from methane is 0.5 degrees. So it sort of seems almost as important as, let's say, CO2. I'll explain why it's not in a minute. If you go to the other end, we see that you have things like sulfur dioxide causing a cooling of around about 0.5 degrees. So basically air pollution causes a short-term cooling effect. And there's all these other components in the middle, some that you heard mentioned before, NOx and carbon monoxide and all these sorts of things. If you add up the components which are warming, it goes to about 1.8 degrees. So if we didn't have these cooling components, these short-lived components, the temperature increase would be more like 1.8 degrees. So there's about 0.7 degrees coming from cooling components. if I just single out what's generally called the long-lived greenhouse gases or the Kyoto gases, the ones we hear about a lot in terms of climate policy, CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, and these fluorinated gases, they have caused around about 1.5 degrees of warming, coincidentally. And these other components over here are generally quite short-lived. The atmospheric lifetimes are very short. You know, contrails from aircraft, for example, a matter of hours even. So these are a very specific type of species. And I should say methane is sort of grouped here as long-lived, but in many respects, it's really a short-lived component. And this has very important consequences for how we mitigate. So that's the big picture contribution to current warming. So why does it matter? You know, what's the difference between the CO2 and the methane? You know, CO2 in this figure is 0.8 degrees, methane is 0.5 degrees. Why don't we hear a lot more about methane? And the reason is one is long-lived and one is short-lived. This, for me, a figure from Michelle Kane is one of the nicest figures I've seen to describe this difference. So on the left here, you have, you know, a stylized figure of methane emissions and carbon dioxide emissions, both going down to 0. And on the right, you have the warming consequences. So if you reduce CO2 emissions to 0, let's say in a straight line in this figure, the warming contribution from CO2 increases. If you reduce your methane emissions, the warming contribution also decreases. And consequently, this has very different impacts on the climate system. So for example, if you're driving your car and you drive your car less, emitting a little bit less CO2, you're still causing warming, and that warming effect is permanent. If you eat less meat, for example, cut your meat consumption in half, then the warming effect from that will be halved as well, roughly speaking. So these two components have very different ways of acting in the climate system. Nitrous oxide, I haven't really shown it here, but it behaves much more like CO2. So as Rona showed in one of her slides, the lifetime of N2O is about 116 years. And in many contexts, it behaves as a long-lived pollutant. So the figure I showed initially showed that 0.8 degrees from CO2, 0.5 degrees from methane. This was based on the historical emissions that we've had up until today. What this figure here shows is if I take emissions in a single year, I think it's 2014 or 2015. So we put all those emissions in the atmosphere in just 1 year and try and model out what's the climate consequences over time. And so each line here is a different type of species, a different emission. The vertical axis is the temperature contribution, and we have time along the horizontal axis. So in the first 10 years, you'll see there is a lot happening. And the most important contributions in the first 10 years is coming from methane, then carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is also very important in the short-term perspective because we emit so much. And you also have these big cooling effects from sulfur dioxide and NOx. But then when you run time out towards, you know, into the future, decade after decade, now after, let's say, 40 or 50 years, the effect of these short-lived components have essentially gone. The effect of CO2 is there forever. And this is essentially why we obsess about CO2 in a climate perspective, because the effect is so permanent. Methane, it's very important to also reduce methane emissions because you additionally get that short-term reduction in temperature. So I could go on and talk about emission metrics now, and I'm not sure who's listening here, but we could have a good discussion about emission metrics and how you compare CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, other greenhouse gases. If you want to, you know, how much can I reduce CO2 emissions to compensate for a reduction in methane emissions or that type of thing. So in the economic efficient method of doing this, you generally allow there to be trading between CO2 and methane and so on. And this is generally done with a global warming potential of 100 years. Hopefully you see from the previous slides that the warming effect of emission of CO2 and methane is completely different. And so using these emission metrics like global warming 100 can lead to some, let's say, perverse outcomes. And it's often best to treat each of these greenhouse gases differently, or separately, I should say, because they have completely different behaviors in the atmosphere, or at least group them into long-lived components and short-lived components. I'm not going to go into the weeds of this, but just to flag it that it's an issue that many of you will be familiar with. So just quickly painting out a picture of where these emissions are coming from, methane and nitrous oxide. Very global perspective here, which continents are the most important ones. Asia, but then Asia also has a lot of population. I'll show a per capita figure in a minute. North America, Europe are important. You know, Oceania right down the bottom, not much population, and so on. So normalizing this by population, it gives you a bit better idea. You'll see in the top of these figures, Oceania comes up a lot. So Oceania, Australia, New Zealand, small populations, big agricultural activities. That's causing the change, the differences there. North America being so high for nitrous oxide, I was a little bit surprised about, but I'd have to look. But this would be coming from agricultural production, and so on. South America also pretty big agricultural production, and so on. So you can go through these. Each country will have its unique distribution by sectors. So what do the sectoral emissions look like? Rona mentioned this a little bit during her presentation. On the left here, we have methane, energy and agriculture, roughly the same size. Energy, primarily things like fugitive emissions, leaks, let's say, from fossil fuel sector. Agriculture, a lot of burping cows and sheep and things like that. And of course, waste, decomposing waste leading to methane. When you go to nitrous oxide, it's pretty much dominated by agriculture, and that's where the big increases are. So this is a very global perspective since we're in Norway, in Oslo, or I am. Just zooming in on the Norwegian picture. These are methane and nitrous oxide emissions in Norway by sector, just to give you a quick overview. Also, this sort of highlights some of the challenges and opportunities with mitigation. On the left, the methane emissions, you'll see the reductions that have happened in Norway are coming from the waste landfills. So there's opportunities to reduce emissions there. Agriculture, it's challenging to reduce methane emissions, although not impossible. And there's been a slight decline in the energy sector. Nitrous oxide is quite interesting, and you see this sort of picture quite often in many developed countries. So I showed in the previous figure, agriculture dominates, but in Norway, small country, some big industrial production, particularly in fertilizer. And so we see the industrial emissions are quite high in the purple color here. And you see in the 2000s, these industrial emissions fell off a cliff. And this has happened in many, for example, European countries where different technologies were found, or different methods were found to produce things like nitric acid that were used in fertilizer production and so on. So there are opportunities to reduce nitrous oxide emissions, but those opportunities will depend on the country, the types of technologies. But when you get to agriculture, those reductions can be quite challenging, although possible. Just quickly on the uncertainties, and I changed the title of this slide right before and made a spelling mistake. So when it comes to these official inventories, emission inventories that countries produce and report to the UNFCCC, they're updated every year based on new methods, new assumptions. It's quite complex to estimate emissions from of methane and nitrous oxide. You often need a model in the background to do this. And each line on this figure and the dot is the year that emission inventory was submitted. So if you go to the left figure, nitrous oxide, the very first dot in about 2003 is the estimate of methane emissions in 2003 made by Norway, and so on for all the other dots. So you'll see there's a lot of variation from year to year. Emissions can suddenly go up or suddenly go down. also this changes back in time, depending on new methods, new knowledge, and so on. This is just showing the variation in the inventories over time, which is one indicator of uncertainty. But on top of that, you have a lot of uncertainty when you're measuring, how many cows are there in Norway and how much methane comes from each cow, those sorts of things. And how does the methane from the cow change if you change the food and so on. These are highly uncertain and make estimating these emissions quite difficult. So coming to the Methane Pledge, which Rona mentioned. So during Glasgow, a group of countries got together and pledged to reduce their methane emissions 30% by 2030. So I'll say a little bit about that. So thinking about opportunities now. First of all, what do emission scenarios say about reductions in methane and nitrous oxide? So when we talk about emission scenarios consistent with 1.5 degrees, we usually focus on the CO2 component. And you hear things like CO2 emissions need to drop 50% in a decade, say 2030, reach net zero in 2050, this sort of framing, maybe go negative after that. So what happens to methane and nitrous oxide? So with the 1.5 degree scenarios on the left, this is methane. There is around about a 30% reduction by 2030 in methane emissions. It goes down to about, let's say, 50% and sort of levels out, slight decline maybe. Most of the early reductions are happening in the fossil sector, some in agriculture, but that sort of floor that you see towards the end of the century is essentially methane coming from agriculture. On the right, nitrous oxide. The first thing, there's a lot of uncertainty. Modelers struggle to match current emissions in their model with historical emissions, but also how you model out the mitigation potential in nitrous oxide is very uncertain. But broadly speaking, you will see nitrous oxide emissions sort of level out, maybe slightly decline, and most of these emissions will remain coming from agriculture. So zooming in on the Methane Pledge, this figure is also showing global methane emissions by sector, just a little bit more detailed than the previous figure. Fossil fuels down the bottom, agriculture in the middle, and then waste on the top. As I mentioned, the sources of fossil fuels and agriculture are similar. Waste is a little bit smaller. And one way to get to the Methane Pledge is generally most ways will have a bigger reduction in fossil fuels. That's where the potential is, things like fixing up leaks and so on. So roughly a 60% reduction in fossil fuels, about a 25% reduction in agriculture, and about 30% in waste. Those sorts of reductions get you in the ballpark of the Methane Pledge of a 30% reduction by 2030. Do we have the technologies to do this? The short answer is, more or less. Using the existing technologies and deploying them at a steady rate out to 2030 would lead to, in this figure, the middle batch of bars there, about a 24% reduction. This is to contrast with if we did nothing to reduce methane emissions. You get the left-hand set of bars there and about an 8% increase in methane emissions. And the right set of bars there is the sort of the goal, the target, if you like, a 30% reduction. So compared to the middle set of bars, you would need some additional reductions in the fossil sector in particular, but also a little bit in agriculture. And I should say, Rona and I have put together a blog post you'll find on the Cicero pages, also a link on the bottom of the slide here, talking about this Methane Pledge and some of the opportunities there. And that was all I was going to say. Thank you. We're ahead of schedule.
We are, Glenn. Thank you so much. Yeah, we have a few questions, and to all of you out there in the audience, please feel free to ask some more in the Q&A function. But I'll start out from Paul Price, and this one is for you, Rona. Has the reduction in global nitrogen fertilizer use in the late 1980s to early 1990s been considered as a substantial contribution to the leveling off in methane concentration in the early 2000s?
Okay, so thank you for your question. So the reduction so basically, in the late 90s and early 2000s, there was this leveling off of the growth rate. So we had this near zero growth rate in methane, so a stable concentration, meaning that so the sources and the sink were approximately during that period approximately in balance. And so Ranhood in her talk showed some evidence that this might be in part at least due to OH changes. Another theory that's being put forward for their sources is that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was in 1991, it's known that with the collapse of the Soviet Union that the economy collapsed as well, and the methane emissions related to that collapse reduced considerably. And so if you have reducing emissions from that reduction in economic activity through the 90s, could have led to that stabilization in methane. Then that's, I think, the most plausible explanation, and possible changes in OH as well. I don't think it has anything to do with changes in livestock numbers. In fact, livestock numbers have been increasing globally. Yeah, so I think that's the most likely explanation.
Yep, thank you, Rona. You also have another question from Svein. He writes, the IPCC report in WG1 AR 5, Chapter 8, partly coordinated by Gunnar Myhre from Cicero, states that methane had a 2% increase in radiative forcing since 2005. What is the current best estimate for the increase in methane radiative forcing from 2005 to 2022?
I had a quick check at the numbers from the latest IPCC report. And they have forcing numbers up to 2019. So it's a 6.3% increase in the forcing.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, and then it's Patrick Erdes. I've seen your question as well, Glenn, but I'll take that after this one. Patrick Erdes, he asks, a well-known fact is that significantly reducing meat consumption will reduce methane emissions. I wonder, would N2O emissions increase or decrease if meat consumption would be significantly reduced globally? This is a free-for-all question.
I think, could I answer that? I volunteer to answer. Yeah, yes, so the short answer is yes, reducing meat consumption would also reduce N2O emissions, and that's because for raising livestock, you need feed, animal feed, and that is, for example, soy or other crops that are grown, and they require fertilizer. So if you reduce the number of animals, so livestock, and you don't need as much feed, of course, for these, then you reduce the amount of nitrogen fertilizer that is needed, and you also reduce the N2O emissions. So yeah, reducing meat intake is a good thing to do.
Yep. Thank you. Glenn, you have a question?
Yes, I have a question for Rona. So on the methane and also a little bit with the nitrous oxide, when you're talking about 2020, there's let's say a climate signal. So with warmer climate, you might get more methane emissions. Likewise, potentially also the same with N2O. So when looking at the longer term trend in the last, I don't know, decade or so, do you see any climate signal increasing microbial emissions?
So from the literature which I've read, the land surface models or terrestrial ecosystem models don't show in the last 1 to 2 decades any trend in wetland methane emissions. So there's a lot of a lot of variability from year to year, lots and lots of variability, but no substantial trend. For N2O, so land surface or terrestrial ecosystem models over very long time scales, so looking at all of the 20th and 21st century, show a positive feedback from climate on N2O emissions from increased temperature. And there's also a small CO2 effect as well, shown from the models. So
if I could just continue on a little bit, sorry, Christine. So with the 2020 anomaly, I think you said 40% from microbial activity, and that was potentially from warmer conditions in Siberia, if I get that correct. Is that do you see that as like a one-off anomaly, extreme event type situation, or potentially a signal in a longer term warming trend?
Yeah. Okay, it's so it is, let's say a fear or quite a likely scenario that as the Arctic warms, the Arctic is warming faster than any other region on Earth. As the Arctic warms, the permafrost is melting, and with that you get possibly new wetland areas, and also trapped in this permafrost soil is so rich organic matter, and as it decomposes, it will emit methane. So the likely scenario is that the Arctic warms, you will get more methane emissions. There's also some uncertainty about that, because as the Arctic warms, you might also get a drainage of wetland areas, because at the moment the permafrost or the permafrost layer acts as an impermeable layer, and so you get so lakes and wetlands. That as the permafrost gradually disappears, you will remove that impermeable layer, and you are seeing disappearing areas where lakes are disappearing and wetlands are disappearing, but you get creation of new ones too. So it's quite uncertain, but I think on general, the likely scenario is that as the Arctic warms, you will get more methane emissions. For 2020, so what we know that Siberia had an extreme heat wave. It was, I think, up to 5 or 6 degrees warmer than usual in the spring and up to June. At the moment, it's uncertain how much methane could have been associated with that. But I think, there is likely that there has been an increase in wetland emissions, not only from the high northern latitudes, but possibly also elsewhere in 2020. And for N2O, I can maybe also just mention that so N2O is also from largest sources from soils, especially agricultural soils, and that is also response to temperature and moisture. So that could be also an explanation of the 2020 anomaly in N2O. The thing with N2O is, well, it was just similar for methane. If the soil dries out completely, then for methane, at least when the soil dries out, the methane is oxidized before it reaches the atmosphere. So you don't have really emissions from dry soils. For N2O, there's a kind of optimum, like a soil moisture optimum, and either too wet or too dry, you won't get as much N2O production.
Thank you. We've had one more question from an anonymous attendee, and this one is a little bit beside what I know that you guys are working on. It's introduced as an offside question, so I'll put it out there and you can decide if you want to answer. Is it possible to measure or model the gas emissions from all explosions happening in the Russia-Ukraine war, and how those gases will affect global warming? So is it possible to say something about that? And do you know if anyone is doing research on it?
I don't think anyone is really looking at that. I don't think there would be much emission from just the explosion itself, unless, of course, they hit a gas facility or something like that. I think what is more important concern is, since Europe is now exploring ways to substitute the loss in gas from Russia, if they start importing gas from the US or other countries by using ships, shipping, that could lead to larger methane emissions, because it's relatively little loss of methane from the pipeline from Russia compared to, it's thought that these other imports of methane could be more leaky, more emitting than the supply from Russia. That might be a concern. But
yeah,
I guess it's
thank you, Rona.
Yeah.
Yep. So if anyone out there still have any questions, please feel free to submit them now. Do you have any more questions, Glenn? It doesn't seem to be.
Maybe I could actually. 2021 had a record increase in methane again. So as you're saying, 2020 wasn't the anomaly. Similar with N2O, but not quite as big increase. But so I guess the methane one's a more interesting one. So what's your, 2021 is finished. I know you haven't run the models, but what's your leading hypothesis for what's happened in 2021? I don't know, Ragnhild, if you have some ideas either from the atmospheric chemistry side.
I haven't looked at the emission. I'm not sure if there is emission estimates for NOx and for 2021.
Maybe just comment that from the atmospheric sink point of view, very different processes for methane versus N2O. So 90% of the atmospheric sink for methane is hydroxyl radical, and that's in the troposphere. Whereas N2O, it's in the stratosphere, and it's due to photolysis and oxygen radical reaction. So these are totally different processes. So if an explanation involves a reduction in OH for methane, that won't explain anything in N2O. So just to point out that the two causes don't necessarily need to be linked, especially if it's if the methane is due to OH changes. But if it's due to changes in the soil emissions, then there could be a common explanation, perhaps. Yeah.
Thank you. Glenn, you have a question from Paul Price. In Paris context of agreeing equitable action to limit to well below 2 degrees, is it the case that cutting all methane, agricultural and fossil, is increasingly critical, as well as primary emphasis on CO2 reduction?
Yeah, so I'd say you need to reduce both as fast as you can. I don't think we're in the luxurious position anymore where you can trade off one with the other. Just increasingly. Yeah, so I guess there's different elements to it. If you want to solve the long-term problem, out to 2100, then there is no way around it but to do everything you can on CO2. But particularly when you're talking about shorter term peaking and the level that you stabilize. So reducing methane emissions radically in the short term may reduce a potential peak in temperature. But also if you're a little bit lazy on methane and keep it constant out to 2100, then you would, for a given level of CO2 mitigation, have a higher temperature. So even in the long term, reducing methane as much as you can will help reduce the temperatures overall. To the degree to which you can separate mitigation of CO2 and methane is a little bit interesting to think about. Also, so there are some correlations between methane and CO2, for example, in fossil sector, but in agriculture, the correlation is much weaker. So, for example, today we see things happening with renewable energy, electric cars, and so on and so forth. So we might see a stabilization in CO2 emissions, or even a decline in CO2 emissions. But at the same time, because the agricultural sector is sort of completely separate from the fossil sector in some respects, we could still see a continuation in the growth of methane. So this sort of slowdown in emissions in the last decade, for example, slowdown in the growth, is primarily happening with fossil CO2 emissions. And it's sort of easy, in a sense, to forget about those reductions in the increase that's happening in methane emissions. So basically, this is getting to the angle that you also need a broad policy that's capturing both the fossil sector, but also the agricultural sector. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah.
Thank you. We have another question from Renaud. Some groups are proposing, in complement to methane mitigation, also atmospheric methane remediation, such as Jackson, RB et al. And there's a link to a paper, Atmospheric Methane Removal, a Research Agenda. Are you familiar with it? What is your opinion on their proposals?
Yeah, I can come in and say something. I don't know if the other two. So we often hear about CO2 removal, so technologies that take CO2 back out of the atmosphere. And that's particularly relevant for CO2 because it's it's a long-term, it's a permanent pollutant, right? It's a cumulative pollutant. So what you put there stays there forever. So if you stop emitting, emissions, temperatures will stabilize. If you want the temperature to come back down, then you have to take the CO2 back out of the atmosphere essentially, or wait a very, very, very long time. With methane, the dynamics are a little bit different. So if you stop emitting methane emissions, then almost immediately the methane concentration should start to come back down. And so in a sense, maybe the methane removal essentially just speeds up the reduction process. Overall, you would think it's much better to reduce your methane emissions, but then some of those emissions from agriculture may be very hard to get rid of. It's not just meat, but also things like paddy rice and so on and so forth. So there may be value in the longer term, in particular, in being able to get some methane out of the atmosphere. It will become a cost question. Interesting scientific question. I don't know, what does it do to the OH radical, and how does that mess around with things if you start removing methane from the atmosphere? I don't know, but yeah, so it's going to come down to a cost question, basically.
Mm. Did you have a comment, Rana?
No, just to reiterate, I mean, what Glenn said, it would come down to a cost. I'm familiar with this paper cited by Jackson, and there's also other papers looking at the possibility of methane removals. But I haven't seen yet a full cost analysis of what this would cost, but I would think it would be very expensive, and I'm afraid it would not be very effective. There are a few methods that are being proposed. I think we cannot get around reducing the emissions of methane.
Thank you. Any other questions out there? Yeah, from Patrick Erdes. Given that N2O is more long-lived than methane, would N2O removal be more relevant?
Yeah, and this, as Glenn showed in one of his slides, that the radiative forcing from N2O is only around 0.1 compared to 0.5. So the warming due to N2O is about 0.1 degree compared to about 0.5 or more from methane. So for N2O, it's still a relatively small contribution. So I think it would be more important to address the CO2 and the methane. N2O, I think, it's very difficult to reduce emissions because they're so tied with agriculture. And I'm not sure, I haven't seen any proposal on how to reduce N2O so far.
Thank you, Rana. Another question here, and now we all need to take into consideration that I'm not a chemist. Other groups are proposing to increase the Cl atom sink in the atmosphere with very low cost estimations. Do you have an opinion on that? And another link to an article by Ming and Tingzhen et al.
Ragnhild, the atmospheric chemist, can you save us here?
Yes, please.
I haven't, I don't know about this paper. So I haven't any opinion.
No. Thank you. Yep. Sorry about that. No answer for that one. Is there anything you guys would like to add? No. If there are no more questions, then I think it's time to round off the webinar. Thank you very much for your presentations, and also thank you to all of you out there joining us today. The next Science Breakfast webinar will be on May 19th. This time it will be in Norwegian, and it's by the Norwegian Institute for Cultural Heritage Research, NICU. And the topic is, how can we meet the consequences of climate change? In Norwegian, hvordan kan vi møte konsekvensene av klimaendringene? Tverrvitenskapelige tilnærminger med utgangspunkt i kulturarv. So we hope to see some of you again in about a month. And until then, have a nice day. Takk for i dag.
Thank you, everybody.